the first comprehensive study on the Italian Parliament since Sartori had done his work in 1963. And I had the venture of reading it because I was also working on Italian Parliament at the time, and we've bumped into each other and talked to each other many times over the years. So for me, it's a pleasure to have him here. I think it's very good to have him also because he's a very good friend of many of the LKY faculty members that come regularly to teach with us. And, he's the Capano of many Ramesh Capano publications. So it's a great pleasure for me to have him here. Giliberto will talk about, Professor Capano will talk about decision under fog. The floor is yours. The usual format is 35 minutes to 40, and then Q&A. But if you wish to switch to the other mode of presentation that you were suggesting, which is you talk and we jump in and we ask a question, we can do it that way. The format will be at the most in 1 hour. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Riccardo. First of all, good evening, everybody. It's almost time of dinner there, probably. Thanks a lot for this invitation. I'm really happy for the chance to present something to this highly reputed center of research. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that as usual is too long for these cases, but could be, I would say, something that could lead my thoughts. What I'm going to do, I'm going to present, wait a moment if I'm capable, I'm going to, okay, now it works. I'm going to present some thoughts I've started to develop during the crisis, the pandemic crisis. But before I start, please allow me to propose a conversation mode for this talk. We are not so many, we are 10, 15 people. So please don't wait to the end of my presentation. Feel free to interrupt me, to ask a question, to disagree on what we are saying. So if we could make this talk more a jam session, I would say scholar conversation could be better for all of us. Also because as usual in this type of talks, the speaker risks to be too synthetic. So please don't worry, interrupt me. Please don't write on the chat. Jump jump on my voice, jump in the arena without any problem. It would be really appreciated if you will be in this way. So first of all, these are really thoughts that I have been developing in the last 2 years, because as many of us, the COVID-19 impacted not only on our personal life, but also on our professional lives. Personally, I started to think again or to rethink on many conceptualization we have in public policy. I spent time to read something again, as I was used to do when I was younger in the literature of organizational theory, and then there is the crisis management literature. So I think that what I'm going to present are really thoughts, and I will start exactly by some reflection on the empirical cases we have dealt with during the last 2 years, the case of COVID-19, a situation in which policymakers had to decide under fog and time pressure. We will see what I mean. And then I will, exactly after having presented some thoughts on the crisis, on the pandemic, I will start to go through the literature, trying to define in crisis again and the methodological and theoretical challenges that we have to deal with crisis after the lessons we could draw from the COVID-19. And then I will try to present, if there will be time, some observations, some thoughts about the potential effects of a crisis for those who are interested to study political and policy change. So I wanna start from what I have called the apparent dilemmas under time pressure. Let's start from really something of really empirical. We perfectly know now that many countries were not prepared to deal with COVID-19, while others gave the impression they were more ready. And I underline gave the impression because, as I will say many times during this presentation, those countries that appeared or seemed to be more prepared at the beginning of the crisis had some problems in the following waves of the COVID-19. However, let's focus on the, on the first wave, on the first unexpected event we had. We know that in many countries, especially in the Western world, there was a lack of PPIs, there were no medical protocols, there were no enough ICU beds. In many countries, then decisions experienced delays due to a clear denial of what was going on. And there is not enough good research on the motivation of this common pattern. I don't know exactly what happened in your country, but I know enough what happened in the Western world. And if you think that the first cases appeared, formally speaking, at the beginning of January 2020, for 2 months, at least for 2 months, in the Western world, in Europe, in Northern America, we were thinking that this was a Chinese issue. And believe me, when we had in Italy the first cases, 21st of February 2020, for 1 week, all the other European countries thought this is an Italian problem. So we have this strange problem of denial that has pushed for a clear delay in the first response. However, sooner or later, all the countries had to take difficult decisions, and thus all the country have to decide under pressure while still being under fog. So we had apparently 2 dilemmas. At the beginning of this crisis, there were 2 dilemmas that the policymakers were assumed to focus on. The first, I define it apparent dilemma because I don't think it's a real dilemma. The first dilemma was the economy versus public health. The idea was, what can we do now? We should pay attention more to the public health, or we should pay attention to the economic issue. And then we had another apparent dilemma, that one of individual freedom versus societal safety. We had some countries in which, since the beginning, started to say we have to prioritize individual freedom. It's not important the societal safety. Other countries stressed more the societal safety. So we had this, I would say, this dichotomy of value of a societal goal. But the point is that have these really been dilemmas for the decision makers? Because we had all, and we still have some literature focusing on these dilemmas. Are we sure that decision makers really try to prioritize between these 2 poles, ideological, ideational poles? All in all, we have seen that almost all the countries try to frame together the 2 arms of each dilemma according to their context, their ideas, their social values, and political interest. We can see that only few countries have really chosen one arm of the dilemma at the expense of the other. These countries are Sweden and Brazil, that opted clearly for economy first, individual freedom first, and China, and for example, Hong Kong, that opted for the horn of public health and societal safety. These are examples, but most of the other countries tried to find an equilibrium between the two horns of this dilemma. And so the true, or better, my personal argument is that those I call apparently dilemmatic choice of the first response were two. If you remember, 2 years ago, there was a big debate between suppression, let's kill the virus, or mitigation, let's try to live with the virus. But the choice among these two strategies has not been driven by an autonomous decision, rather it has been pushed by the following factors. First, the time needed to recognize the existence of the problem and to make sense of it. One thing is to perceive that we have the problem when you have the first signal of an emergent virus. Another thing, in this case, you can go for suppression. Another case is when the virus is already diffused in the community because there has been a process of denial, you know what I mean? And the other factor, the perception of risk when the first cases appeared. And we can see how the societal values make a difference here. There are some countries in which the perception of risk is really high. So immediately after the first cases appeared, there was immediately a suppression reaction, and other countries in which the perception of risk was weaker. All in all, we can discuss a lot that the differences in the political regimes, the health system, the social culture matter to choose the first response. But all in all, what emerged is that the first response has been driven by the time dimension and the perception of risk dimension, which is a bit interesting if we think about this. If it is clear, I go ahead and let's to focus a bit on those I call myths and commonplaces when dealing with crisis that have been, I would say, delegitimated, according to me, thanks to the COVID-19 experience. Here you can see a big table, in which I have put on the left column, for you should be the right, the myths and deep-rooted convictions on how to deal with the crisis. In the column in the middle, some evidence coming from the COVID-19 experience. In the third column, you can see some unexpected consequences. First myth, and this is a myth you can find, is not hegemonic, but very often majoritarian in different stream of literature, then when you have a crisis, you should rely on previous similar experience. In my world, in the Western world, for months, we have heard, you know, in East Asian countries, they were more prepared because they had the experience of SARS, the first, or of MERS. But what emerged from COVID-19 is that COVID-19 had different characteristics from SARS, first from MERS, and from H1N1, swine flu. And all in all, that some Asian countries did well in the first wave, but performed worse in the medium-long term, for example. Thus, what is the unexpected consequence with respect to this myth, according to the COVID-19 evidence, is that proceeding by analogy can be misleading. Every crisis could be different. Then the second myth is ask the expert. Following the science, evidence-based policymaking, and this idea that expert advice is neutral, But as we have discovered during this crisis, in all the countries, or in most of the countries, experts gave very different indication. For example, in the UK, in Sweden, and in most of continental Europe, we had experts saying very different things. This means that according to this evidence, technical advice is never neutral. Experts very often, when we have this highly ambiguous and uncertain crisis, experts very often provide contradictory advice, and very often there is the problem of the bias selection of experts. So we have, I would say that the whole stream of literature focus on the politics of expertise is right. Then there is the third myth that underline that should be better to have a diversity of experts to avoid groupthink and cognitive pitfalls. But as we know, in many countries during the COVID-19 crisis, experts disagreed with each other. So this is another interesting consequence respect to some myths that are embedded in the literature, is that diversity of experts may create entropy, increase the complexity of the problem, and paradoxically, the diversity of experts could increase the ambiguity of the problem, of the interpretation of the definition of the problem. Then we have, I would say, one of the pillars of the myths in crisis management, and that is that the political leaders must show confidence, competence, and the ability to meaning-making, to provide an authoritative account of what is going and on what needs to be done. But the evidence coming from COVID-19 show that suppression and eradication strategy prove effective in the short term, but then paradoxically this increased the capacity of spreading of the Delta variant. So substantially, if the meaning making is too strong, you eliminate one of the horn of the dilemma, and then you pay the bill later. So the unexpected consequence is that pay attention, this myth of leaders who should do meaning making is a risk of simplifying the problem. Framing is always a simplification and a selection, and there is very often the risk of cutting off part of the trade-off. Then we have, I would say, the king of the commonplaces of the myth in many streams, not in all the stream of organizational theory, public policy, public administration, that to respond to a big crisis, you need centralized decision-making. But we have discovered during the COVID crisis that the center of the system sometimes made the wrong decision because they did not have the right knowledge. And that all in all, in many cases, the right knowledge was found in peripheral nodes. So if you allow me, there is this novel that everyone knows, written by Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace, where you have the representation of the Battle of Borodino. Is a very important battle between the Russian and the French armies. And you can see Napoleon thinking, he was up in the hill, thinking that he was in charge to rule, to steer the battle. But as he discovered, because he defeated in that battle, the decision was the most important decision in that battle were taken at a decentralized level, you know what I mean, in the ground. So what could be the consequence here is that decision should migrate around the organization in search of a person who has the specific knowledge. What we have learned in this crisis is that centralized decision-making work, but not alone. And there is also the need to have some relevant decentralized processes. Is it okay? Because I cannot see all of you. So if you have any questions.
Sorry, Capano, can I ask you one thing? You're looking at the decision taken by national governments, you know, what they did, what they have not done, what they could have done better, the fact that they had or didn't have access to good knowledge, and they sometimes make bad decision. But to some extent, the international community, international organizations or supranational institutions like the EU have also played a role providing kind of guidance. So to what extent that failed to homogenize the responses the national governments gave?
Thanks a lot, Riccardo, for this question. I've never thought about that because I've been focusing more on national responses, and in the Italian case also in subnational responses. However, you can apply, for example, some of this myth also to the international organization like the World Health Organization. You know what I mean? They had different. They proposed different interpretation of the crisis. Don't forget that at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, their advice was wearing mask is not important, for example. You know what I mean? So if you know what I mean, everyone has forgotten this because 2 years could be like a century in the life of the people. But if you remember, you know, we had very, very, very contrasting advices from this kind of organization, for example. And I think that you could try to apply the problem of these 5 myths also to the behavior of some international organizations. So I have followed as an observer the behavior of the WHO, but probably you can apply this also to other international organizations. I don't think that there is a difference, you know, because I think that when you have this kind of crisis, the problem of the dilemma applies everywhere substantially, you know. And you know better than me that there are many international organizations are never neutral. They very often are pushed to give a specific meaning making and so on. So I think that this way of thinking or this thought could be applied also to international organizations, although I have never deepened this dimension.
Okay. Thank you.
Then the dimension of the fog, you know, because we had decision makers at the beginning of the crisis deciding in the fog. And the fog mean that they were between uncertainty and ambiguity. Definitions, very short. Uncertainty is the lack of appropriate knowledge about problems, solution, and cause-effect relationships. So we can define it as a kind of objective dimension that can help escape the fog. It can be considered a kind of technical dimension. So when you have this kind of highly uncertain crisis, for a certain period of time, you have the lack of appropriate knowledge. But then, as we will see, you can feel this uncertainty. Ambiguity is different, because ambiguity is the possibility of having different interpretation of problem, solution, future outputs, and outcomes. So ambiguity is the subjective, or could be defined as the subjective dimension of the effort made to escape the fog. It's value-driven. Thus, it is a political dimension. So never forget, when the fog was really dense at the beginning of this crisis, we had high uncertainty because we didn't know exactly what to do in terms of how to stop the diffusion of the virus, how to take care of the hill people and so on, but there was also a high level of ambiguity, different interpretation of what was going on. Let's focus on what happened. So what I call the dynamics of uncertainty. Uncertainty during this type of crisis involves not only policymakers, but also experts. At the beginning of this type of crisis, also experts are uncertain about substantially the relationships, cause and effects. You know what I mean? But over time, uncertainty has diminished because of the following factors. First of all, we got more knowledge about the problem, what the virus was, how it works, and so on. It took weeks, months, but at a certain point we knew the enemy. Oh, sorry. Then we had increased awareness of the potential solution, such the development of therapies and the vaccines. It took months, but this means that the level of uncertainty clearly decreased. And we got a different comprehension of the strategies adopted to combat the virus, including the effects of various containment strategy and the effect of vaccination campaign, you know what I mean? So we can say that in the following months, a high level of uncertainty clearly decreased. However, decreasing uncertainty can increase ambiguity. For example, more information about the way the virus works, the benefits of vaccines can increase the divergence of interpretation of vectors with respect to that can be done in terms of easing restriction and limitation placed on the individual behavior. So we have this paradox. While we have been capable to decrease uncertainty, the decreasing of uncertainty has, I would say, pushed to increase ambiguity, because when you control from a technical point of view this kind of crisis, then you feel more free to present your values, to give your interpretation. In fact, let's focus on the dynamics of ambiguity. The crisis, we know, has been characterized since the beginning by high uncertainty and high ambiguity. Ambiguity has been structurally favored by a diverse array of experts. In the first phase of the crisis, the first wave, the role of political leadership has been pivotal in contrasting or limiting ambiguity. So paradoxically, at the beginning, we had high uncertainty, we had high ambiguity, but the role of political leaders was exactly that, to control, to contrast, to limiting the ambiguity. You can put in narrative terms, you can find different national leaders' narrative during the first wave, but all these narratives had the goal to limit contrasting the ambiguity, about the crisis. However, while uncertainty has diminished, ambiguity has increased over time because people feel less threatened. When you are vaccinated 3 times, you know what I mean, you feel you feel less threatened. The negative effects of the crisis are more visible. The socio-economic effects become more and more visible. And then there is more room for the battle of political narratives and framing. So we had this interesting situation during our battle against in the fog, is that ambiguity at a certain point has increased, favored by the fact that we have been quite capable to decrease uncertainty. What then does the COVID-19 experience teach us? It's interesting that those countries that have been considered the best performance during the first year of the pandemic, substantially those countries choosing a suppression method, East Asian countries, New Zealand, Australia, have created the condition for a mediocre performance against Delta and the Omicron variants. Probably because due to their performance in the early stage of the pandemic, they have been slower in planning their respective vaccination campaign. You know what I mean? This is quite interesting because the more you have been capable to suppress the virus, the more you have felt capable to control the pandemic. However, complex decisions with high uncertainty, high ambiguity, involve trade-offs that one must be aware of. Each strategy has its advantages and disadvantages. Opting to take only one arm of the dilemma will incur a cost that is to be paid sooner or later. Gathering more information and knowledge about the problem usually reduce uncertainty. Yes, but this makes the problem more complex and multifaceted, which can increase ambiguity. Simplify the problem, yes, but proceeding by analogy is a cognitive shortcut, you know what I mean? And then if you simplify the problem, you can reduce ambiguity and perhaps even uncertainty. But this could be effective in the short term. In the medium term, it can backfire. Centralization, yes. It's clear that if you are a policymaker, it's better, more practical, more effective to capitalize on a single expert than from an homogeneous group of experts. However, the single expert, this happened in Sweden, for example, will tend to present the problem in a less uncertain and ambiguous way. However, under condition of extreme uncertainty, useful knowledge and the most effective solution may be found at the peripheral node of the network. If decision-making is centralized, you can overlook and lose this knowledge. Expert diversity, yes, but this increases contradictory and bizarre advices. It increases ambiguity and does not necessarily decrease uncertainty. So said, based on these lessons, I want to go to use these thoughts developed during the crisis, thinking about the impact of COVID-19. I wanted to come back to reason from a more theoretical and methodological way about the crisis as, I would say, a very, very challenging scientific object. If you do not have questions, may I go ahead, or you prefer to put some question now on what I have said? Please. Madi Canafaya.
Yeah, Professor Capano. So, do you mean that this kind of framework can be applied also not only just pandemic crisis, but also to some kind of war crisis and other types of crisis?
You know, this is something on which I could be more precise exactly during the next part of my presentation. I would say that there are different types of crisis, you know what I mean? As I will try to say, for example, in the literature, there is this distinction between slow and fast burning crisis, you know what I mean? When you have a slow burning crisis, you can apply what I'm thinking. So a war depends on, you know what I mean, in the sense that a war could be, you know, Blitzkrieg, German Nazi way, I would say, it could be years and years. So we have to distinguish type of crisis. It's quite clear that we are talking about systemic crisis. That means crisis that I would say are challenging, are threatening all the pillars of a society, you know what I mean? It's not a crisis after an earthquake, for example, you know what I mean? This is something that you can manage also because you have certainty about what to do respect to the effect of the crisis. So we are talking about systemic crisis. And this is something that allowed to me to go ahead in my presentation, because at this point it's relevant to define what a crisis is, you know what I mean? Otherwise, we are talking about a word, a concept that can mean different things to different people. So thanks to this experience in which we have seen a lot of interesting events, and I would say many myths and commonplaces, I would say, put under discussion, let's come back to the general problem. What is a crisis? You know, Reinhard Koselleck, who is a quite famous historian of ideas, in a book written in 2006, defined the crisis as constitutive of a contemporary world. That means substantially that crisis is everywhere. I disagree, because if we use word, but you know, just to give an idea that crisis is at the center of the contemporary reflection. Colin Hay, 20 years ago, it's not the case that he complained that crisis is one of the most undeveloped concepts in state theory. It is an ubiquitous term that is characterized by its notorious imprecision. What? So Colin Hay asked us, but what does really crisis mean? It is everywhere, but if it is everywhere, it's used for defining different things. You know, you stretch the concept, you don't have a real concept. We know that crisis can be, for example, in the literature, structural and long-lasting, or could be brief, tumultuous and fatal moments in time in which actual decisions become paramount. Structural, long-lasting, or brief and tumultuous. We have definition of acute versus chronic, manifest versus latent crisis. We know that the scope of crisis can be systemic, involving the whole functioning of a political system, or local, sectorial. We know, I'm a political science, as many of you, that we know that there are many streams of the literature focusing on crisis in international and foreign politics and policy. Allison, George, Jarvis, Lebo, for example, these are classics of this field. There is a particular attention on elite, bureaucrats, and leadership during crisis. In political and democratization studies, there is a crisis refers usually to the phases of disorder of national democratization process. In public policy, very often crises refer to policy inefficiency, ineffectiveness, and failure. Okay. However, you can read a lot and the term still maintains its ambiguity. When we refer to crisis, the immediate question still is, whose crisis are we talking about? There are many scholars who underline the subjective nature of what crisis is and of its outcomes. That could be political, social, and policy outcomes. If we accept that there is a subjective dimension of crisis, then we should focus for defining crisis on some anchors that cannot be the causes of the crisis, but the effects of those ongoing processes that weaken the capacity of the actual political system. Put in another way, then, we could define a crisis as the incapacity to deal with known, routinary, or unexpected external or internal events. So substantially, a crisis is the inability, the incapacity to deal with unexpected events. The idea is that pay attention very often when we talk about crisis, we define a crisis based on the causes of the crisis, you know what I mean? But what
But this is
really,
Carl Schmitt, no?
sorry?
This is state of exception that Carl Schmitt was talking about,
Okay.
constitutionally speaking.
Okay, this is a very, very, I would say, courageous comparison, but you know, I'm not talking about the state of exception or extraordinary moment. I'm talking about non-routinary or unexpected external or internal events. If you know what I mean, too often when we define crisis, we talk about the causes of the crisis, but the causes of the crisis are not the crisis. The crisis for us is the situation in which we perceive that we are not capable to deal in a proper way with this unexpected event. Put in another way, try to, what was why the pandemic, COVID-19 was a crisis? Because a virus appeared. If you focus on the causes of the virus, you know, there'll still be this crazy discussion. Oh, it has natural roots, natural origins from some woodland in the northeastern China, or it's something produced in a laboratory. It's not relevant. For us, for many countries, COVID-19 was a crisis because for a specific period of time, different systems were unable to deal with this unexpected event. And we can talk all the life about the fact that there were many scientists who have been foreseen for a big pandemic, but the impact of this pandemic was like the impact of an unexpected event. So let's focus on the fact that a crisis is a kind of incapacity to deal with not routinary or unexpected events. And then we can probably better theorize and better research on crisis. I don't know if this point is clear, because I understand that there could be some different opinion. Thus, I think that there is a piece of the literature on crisis management that offers the more convincing and empirically useful definition of crisis. A crisis is a serious threat to the basic structure of fundamental values and norms of a system, which under time pressure and highly uncertain circumstances necessitate making vital decisions. So a crisis is a serious threat to the basic structure of fundamental values of a society, simply because you are incapable to deal with some unexpected events. So they are serious acute challenges that causes a grave disruption of the status quo, a major reduction in some social, political, policy function of the system that threatens further drastic deterioration and thus pushes the affected system toward different outcomes possibilities ranging in a continuum from full recovery of systemic functioning or a total collapse. Is it clear? Okay. There is, if we accept the idea that crisis can be defined as this incapacity to deal with something that is unexpected due to internal or external events, let's focus for a moment on some cognitive dimension of crisis. We have three properties of a crisis: threat, urgency, and uncertainty. We have some characteristics, and then we have what I define the problem of cognitive dimension that can explain something respect to the first response to this kind of systemic creeping crisis. one of the first property of a crisis is that it is a threat to shared societal values, life-sustaining systems, individual health, wealth, social political order, political legitimation. This is one of the property of a systemic crisis. It's clear that you have a cognitive dimension with respect to this threat, exactly because this could be a serious threat to societal value. You could be pushed to underestimate this threat, to deny this threat, to remove this threat, and then slowly you can recognize and be aware of this. The same logic, cognitive process, can be applied to the urgency of a crisis, that is the intensity and the scope of the collective perception of the threat, and to uncertainty, the lack of appropriate knowledge about problems, solution, and cause-effect relationship. For all these three properties of a crisis, you can apply this, what I define the problem of the cognitive dimension. That means that you should recognize this threat, the urgency, and the uncertainty. But very often people, but not only people, government tend to underestimate the risk, to deny this threat, to remove this threat. And then through a slow process, you can start to recognize that there is a threat, there is an urgency, there is an uncertainty, and then to be aware. And this problem of the cognitive dimension is very relevant because it is linked to the temporal dimension of every crisis. A crisis exists because you have an internal or external event, whose effect you recognize to touch the systemic capacity to deal with it. If you do not recognize it, it's quite clear that you are, I would say, helping the crisis to diffuse its problems. And I think that from this point of view, you can apply this problem, the cognitive dimension of the three properties of a crisis, to all the big crises you can imagine. You can apply, for example, this the problem of the cognitive dimension, for example, just to jump in sad things, just for example to the actual crisis, international crisis that we have in Ukraine, for example. You know what I mean? We can think in different way about the causes of the process, but the fact that this is a crisis, it's quite clear. And the fact that there has been a process before the explosion of the crisis of underestimation, denial, and removal from both the sides, let's say in this way, both the part involved in this crisis, and I'm not talking only of Russia, Ukraine, show that very often this is the subjective dimension of crisis. The property of crisis, threat, urgency, and uncertainty needs to go to solve the problem of the cognitive dimension. I don't know if this is clear. So I wanna finish in 5 minutes to give you 15 minutes for questions. So there are other relevant dimensions of crisis. The scope, you know, it can be a small scope or larger scope. The predictabilities. There are some crises that are more predictable than other crises. You know what I mean? Influenceability, that means the dimension focused on the possibility that policymakers can influence the crisis. The probability of a crisis. The controllability of causes of a crisis. The locus of the case, the place, the venue, and the temporal dimension of the crisis. And I think that the temporal dimension is very, very relevant because a crisis could last 1 year or 10 years, could last, could be very fast and could be very slow. So these are dimensions of crisis on which we should probably do more research to understand exactly how to deal with crisis. Without there are a few challenges then, I will conclude with this. Without the proper consideration of the cognitive dimension of the key properties of crisis, we risk to miss structural dynamics and to underestimate causal mechanisms. Threat and urgency are dimensions that are more manipulable and subject to political contrasting framing. You know what I mean? This is something on which we should be aware. The threat of a causes and the urgency are manipulable by policymakers. And then we should also reason, and this is very challenging from a theoretical point of view, that the fact that the decreasing level of uncertainty that characterize every crisis development influence the perception of threat and urgency, as well as the mechanism that they have activated at the peak of the crisis. The short-run perspective that we necessarily have adopted in our research on COVID risks to theoretically influence further research. There is a risk of theoretical lock-in effects. If you focus on the short-term response, you risk to lose the characteristic of the medium long-term effects and responses. Without the proper consideration of the dimension of crisis, we risk to over or underestimate the object of study and its scientific and social relevance. For example, without considering the temporal dimension, we risk inappropriate and misleading generalization, you know what I mean? And try to think on what was our idea about how to respond and about the effects of COVID-19 during the first 3 months, and what is our idea today. It's completely different, because if you change the time perspective of the analysis, the time span, you do another kind of analysis. Without considering predictability or influenceability of a crisis, we risk to overemphasize the negative role of politicians and bureaucrats, because sometimes we accuse politicians and bureaucrats of to be responsible of some crisis, but you know, there are crises in which policymakers cannot influence the process structurally. Without a precise design of the scope of the crisis, we risk to generalize local or sectoral characteristics. I want to finish, sorry. I think that in the medium-long run, we have the problem to understand if crises can be drivers of change. You know, there is a sentence or a commonplace, I would say, very, very diffused nowadays, that is, after COVID, nothing will be the same. It's not true, you know what I mean? It's simply not true, because it depends. It depends on the context, on the political system. So we could have 4 different dynamics of policy, 4 different policy dynamics triggered by crisis. We can end reversion with simply coming back to the previous situation, something resilience, you know, whatever it means. But, you know, you have a crisis and then you bounce back to the similar situation. You can have normalization, for example. Normalization means that some consequences of the crisis are, internalized by the system. You know what I mean? So I know that many people here around in the Western world will be considered normal to wear masks when taking a train or a flight for the rest of their life, for example. You know what I mean? Then you could have adaptation, which is something more than normalization. Means that you that you adapt a different social structure to be prepared to the next crisis. And then you have acceleration. That means that processes that were already started during the period before the crisis are accelerated due to the crisis. Think, for example, to the use of online teaching in university, for example. You know what I mean? This the crisis has accelerated this process. So the real problem from a theoretical point of view is that not necessarily crisis we produce in the medium long-term policy change. They can produce, I would say, no change, that is reversion, normalization, that is, individual internalization of some issues, or they could produce, or crisis can produce two different types of changes, but that are changes like adaptation and acceleration that are not revolutions, you know what I mean? Could be like acceleration, the capacity to speed processes that were already started in the period before the crisis. I think it's enough. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your patience in hearing me.
Thank you, Professor Capano, for a very interesting presentation. I think we have another 13 minutes on my watch, so the floor is open for anybody who wants to ask a question. Please go ahead.
If I may start.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Capano. Very interesting. I would like to clarify one moment that you mentioned in the first part of your presentation, which is about uncertainty and ambiguity, right? There's two dimensions. I was just wondering whether the decrease in uncertainty necessarily leads to increase in ambiguity. Because in uncertainty, you are talking about this technical knowledge, right? But it seems to me that when we get kind of more knowledge about the crisis, let's say, and then the level of ambiguity should also decrease, no?
No, if we accept the definition I have proposed of ambiguity, that is based on the fact that you have different values in a society, and then you can have different interpretation of the same fact of the same event. You know what I mean? So when you are in a situation of big crisis, you know what I mean, big crisis, it's quite clear that there is the perception that a community should behave like one individual, you know what I mean. So there is no ambiguity. But it's like when a country is in war, you know what I mean? Just to be clear, when a country is in war, there is this tendency of all the people living in that country to feel like only one man or only one woman, you know what I mean? In the sense that, no ambiguity, no discussion. Okay, I know you have different ideas, but now we have to survive. Okay, then when the war is ended, ambiguity from this point of view raise again, because there are different ideas, different values, and so it's the same for a crisis, you know what I mean? In many countries, in the first period of a big crisis, there is the tendency, also thanks to the national narrative proposed by political leaders, there is this tendency to keep the level of ambiguity respect to the problem very low, because we have to fight against the virus, we have to fight against the enemy, we have to fight against this problem. But when we have acquired enough knowledge about how to treat this virus, how to treat this enemy, then the different interpretation of the same problem have more. This is the idea, you know what I mean? So
sorry, Professor Capano, Dr. Lodi is not able to ask the question, so he asked me to read this question to you.
Who?
Dr. Lodi.
Okay.
And his question is, I lost his question. Why power is absent from this analysis? Is it because power has been divorced from Western political science, or power did not play a role from individuals to states? We have seen the abuse of power in the name of XYZ.
I don't know why power has not. This is a good question. I thank for it. I don't know why when I talk about political leaders, I'm talking about power. When I talk about ambiguity, I'm talking about different groups having different ideas who wanting more power. You know what I mean? I think that power in this sense is always present when you treat this type of crisis, because you have political leaders, we have policymakers, and so on. And all in all, it's quite clear. You know, my focus was more on the policy dynamics, on the organizational characteristics, and not about, I would say, the political process, thanks to which you can deal with this type of crisis. You know, because I think that you cannot put everything in the basket, otherwise but only for that, you know what I mean. But again, I think that when we talk about political power during time of crisis, we should accept the idea that there is a structural verticalization of political power in every kind of political system, you know what I mean, in a way or in another. We had a prevalent role of prime minister in democratic, in parliamentary democracy, a stronger role of president in a presidential system, the usual stronger role of dictators in authoritarian system, and so on. You know what I mean? So I think that we have to accept that the normal political dynamics is a bit less relevant during the first stages of a systemic crisis.
Went up.
Thank you, Professor Capano. I just have a couple of questions regarding, first of all, your characterization of the way that the government or the society has dealt with the COVID situation. And you suggested, for example, experts, and then you have authoritarian style, and then you have a unified leadership. I was just wondering, you seem to suggest that they're mutually exclusive, in the sense that unified leadership precludes the inclusion of experts in the kind of decision making that the unified leadership has engaged in dealing with the issue. So it could be a mixture of unified leadership that incorporates the views of experts, and so you are not necessarily having experts excluded from the decision making with regard to how to deal with the problem, right? That's my first question. The second question I have is with regard to this coming back to Zanibek's question about how reducing uncertainty can lead to increasing ambiguity. Now, the way I see it, of course, I mean, the way that we dealt with COVID, and you asked the question how we dealt with COVID a year or 2 years from now ago, and versus how we dealt with COVID now. I mean, it basically boils down to uncertainty. I mean, uncertainty, as you have the characterization of unknown in the first few months of first 6 months of COVID, and we are now moving to a case of known unknown. And so the way we deal with it, of course, is very different. And so it is a decreasing or declining uncertainty in a sense that we know more about the cause, effect, and so on. But it doesn't necessarily mean increasing ambiguity. And here it has to do with how much information is being provided by the leadership or the government, and how much trust the people have in the leadership or in the government. And here, I again, of course, trust is not mentioned here. How trust can affect the way that a crisis is handled. So I'm just curious on your views on that. Yeah.
No, thanks a lot, Professor, for this observation. I wanna start from the second one. I'm not saying that what I propose are, I would say, hegemonic dynamics. I want to simply problematize this relationship between uncertainty and ambiguity. And you have cited, the problem of trust, you know what I mean, which is quite relevant. There are a lot of interesting comparative publication in political science, comparing the role of trust in government in managing, for example, with the crisis. It's okay, but I would say that you are measuring the capacity of the government to sustain their narrative for certain period, you know what I mean? Then again, let's focus on the temporal dimension. It's quite clear that the more you trust during the first period of a pandemic, your government, the more ambiguity will be taken under control, you know what I mean? But again, wait a moment and do the same research 2 years later, you know what I mean? When many people have been triple vaccinated, and when you don't feel so uncertain, and then again what is normal, you know, the ideas and values will matter again, and the same people who trusted you as government 2 years ago now trust less because they are less threatened, and then they can have their first choice, their first preference. So I think that again it's a problem of temporal span of analysis when we talk about the relationship between uncertainty and ambiguity. And this, so I think you are right, but again, we should put in context. So it's the time dimension. And I think that this connects perfectly to your first question. It's quite clear that you pass from an unknown to an apparently known or known, but the more you know something about that technical cause-effect relationship respect to a crisis, to a virus, the less there is pressure on people to feel threatened by the risk to live health, to live wealth, and so on, you know. And this is because I think I'm not saying that necessarily decreasing uncertainty means increasing ambiguity, but I think that we have to put this relationship over time. This is because I found very, very interesting all this, very sophisticated comparative research, 20, 25, 30, 40 countries, focused on the governmental trust as independent variable respect to the behavior of the people. But it's okay if the time span is the first 6 months from the explosion of the crisis, it's okay. Again, I want to see in 2 years or three years, you know what I mean? When you have the medium-long effects of a systemic crisis, because we are talking about systemic crisis here, not about a normal earthquake, terrible, but, localized flood or something of that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. We are apparently all very shy. All right, well, in that case, Professor Capano, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. We
have been precise. It's 7 there, huh?
Yes.
Perfect.
It's 7. Dinner time. We will put this presentation on YouTube for millions of viewers, and of course, and more. Thank you so much for giving this presentation. It was a real pleasure. We were hoping to bring more customers to this presentation, but end of the semester paper writing has prevented us from bringing here a bigger audience. So for that, we apologize, but we are most grateful you participated, and we hope to see you again, hopefully in person. Every year we run our own conference, this year is the 6th year we run it, and we hope that maybe next year, when we go back to being fully in person, you may come and join and present the paper here with us. It would be a pleasure for us to have you.
Could be a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a
Bye-bye.
great
Bye.
Have a great dinner eventually.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Yes, of course.